Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Healing Growth Podcast. My name is Saiton Riga, and this is a podcast where we talk about healing trauma in an African faith context. Today's episode is the one about Parentification, Part 1. Hey everyone, I'm so grateful to have you listening on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Anchor, and Spotify. Shout out to our YouTube viewers. Thank you everyone. Thank you all for sharing your feedback, and also thank you for listening to us on the Edifi podcast app. We're on the network, so download the app to listen to us and also to find other faith-led podcasts. You can head over there. Do share the podcast with your friends, rate it, and let us know what you think. I do appreciate reading your stories on healing. If you'd like me to read them out, send them to our email, which is healing.growthpodcast@gmail.com. On Instagram, we are healing.growth, and on Facebook, we are Trauma Healing and Growth. The word parentification is a mouthful. It's also one that needs defining. It has been misunderstood and in some ways not accepted, simply because it is something that we grew up with and something that's been normalized, especially in the African, I think also Latina and Asian cultures, especially for the firstborn daughters and in many cases as well, the firstborn sons. So, what is parentification? It is when a child has responsibilities placed on them that are inappropriate considering their age and abilities. These responsibilities can include practical duties such as parenting younger siblings, paying bills, or emotional support such as acting as a confidant. How does it differ from parenting? Parenting means that you give age-appropriate tasks and enable your child as they gain competence, and as they grow, give them necessary support and adjustments. However, when the tasks are beyond a child's capabilities and cause them to feel overwhelmed and struggle because it is a task that ideally a parent should do, then that is parentification. I want to issue a disclaimer here. I am very well aware that we are in Africa and majority of the world, this is something that seems like a luxury. However, I would like to say something in regards to traditionally how this was still done in certain ways, but there was communal support and the child often had other people who would be able to help them, even though not necessarily their parents, because many tasks were done according to ages and class and just in particular ways where people were grouped in ages. But there was help. Like, for example, the women and children would do things together. And so the children would still do tasks, but they would have help. One of the things that I feel like we struggle with in modern society is the isolation that has come out of modernization, living in cities, where the nuclear family is what the child has. And with the parents forced to work, if they're not available because their work causes them to be maybe there for long hours, it means that more and more children are being left alone and they are being left to deal with things that ideally they shouldn't. And I would like us to think about solutions, not just for the middle class and the wealthy, but solutions which would enable us to empower our children so that they're not struggling alone in situations like this. So in terms of emotional parentification and just emotional parenting, let's just go into that. I would say it's not wrong for your child to know and see that you are upset as a parent and for you to even give them an age-appropriate reason. However, when you turn to your child for comfort or make them your confidant and advisor or pit them against other adults, then that is parentification. Children shouldn't be involved in things like that. A parent is meant to care for their child emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, and financially. If a child is playing these roles, as wise as they may seem, they don't actually have the capabilities to fully understand the adult world or the consequences of actions or even understand the weight of the responsibilities placed on them. Parentification is common in families with high levels of stress, with a parent who is a drug or alcohol addict, one who is under high economic stress. In some divorce situations of persistent neglect, physical abuse, physical and mental illness, and situations of sexual abuse as well. It is also highly common when you have one or both parents who were parentified as children, and so they don't have a good sense of what is age appropriate because they were doing things that were far beyond their age when they were kids. There are different types of parentification. I'll break them down so we can have a better understanding. Number 1, instrumental parentification. This is a parentification that requires a child to do certain tasks above their age and maturity for their parents or siblings to maintain the home. The child might need to work while young to pay bills, or they may need to be the parent in the home cooking, cleaning, and caretaking for younger children because the parents are not there. And basically, this child just doesn't get to be a child at all. The demands and requirements upon them are too much. Now, this is controversial again because, like I said, many cultures are okay with this. However, my personal measure for this, if you have it as a culture, is there an adult present supervising and helping the child learn these tasks, and somebody who's easily available if there is a problem, something that is beyond the child's capability. And on top of that, when I say somebody who's available, it means willing to help and train and even take over the tasks and not demean the child or withhold affection for the child not doing or completing the task. Or even just being kind to the child as they're going through this with them. In many situations, however, the parents or the adults delegate the child and abandon the child to do this thing. And what they don't realize is if your child is doing these tasks, then it means that they're also not with their peers being a child. And essentially, their childhood is lost. One of the types of instrumental parentification is sibling-focused parentification. We laugh about it and we talk about it a lot online, but if you stop and think about how much anxiety and perfectionism traits that African firstborn daughters have, and how they missed out on their childhood by having to be deputy parents, and how even as adults, that whole situation has affected their relationships with their siblings because they're not a sibling, they're a pseudo-parent. So they're a parent without necessarily the authority and the power that comes with it, but with the responsibilities that were required of them. It's interesting when you watch them how many of them struggle to relax and have a good time. They still carry a lot of anxiety and can still be extremely codependent, sacrificing themselves for everyone else. That for many of them, their family's success and prosperity have cost them themselves and their dreams. I would add that there's a different dynamic for eldest sons where they can be made providers for the family, and there's a reluctance for them to partner or get married because they are expected to parent and provide for their younger siblings at the expense of their own marriages and children. In many ways, this has brought a lot of resentment and toxic situations in marriages, with the wives and the children also bearing the brunt and being blamed. But what I'd like for us to think about is when we look at current society, it's likely that the Gen Zs and the Generation Alphas are not going to carry on this cycle. So it means in the coming days, there will be people who will be abandoned by both their parents and elder siblings who will refuse to conform or continue the cycle. I would also like to clarify that sibling-focused parentification is not just limited to the eldest. I have seen other siblings being roped into caring for their other siblings, especially if they are the responsible ones, the intelligent ones, or the ones who, for certain reasons, their lives have worked out. They're roped into being responsible for the other siblings, who, especially the ones who are seen as wayward. And this does affect the sibling relationship because there's a resentment because why are you speaking to me or treating me like a parent when you're my peer, when I'm older than you, or you're just my sibling? Why? There's a way in which the dynamic gets completely twisted, and it affects the relationship for generations. The parent-focused parentification is what I discussed briefly before, and it is a form of instrumental parentification. Again, as mentioned, where the child is doing the caretaking of the parent or making decisions for the parent or stepping into situations because their parent is incapable, unwilling, absent, sick, an addict, or has passed on. The tasks that the child is doing are benefiting the parent. You'll hear stories of children whose parents are in debt, and instead of dealing with the debtors, they will have the children lie or pretend that they're not there so that they can avoid the debtors. Dealing with a debtor is an adult's task. It should never be a task that the child has to deal with. It's also extremely unpleasant for us as adults. So how much more stress do you think is put on this child and how much more anxiety do you think they have to face? Because in their minds, they are saving their parents and they have to save their parents and themselves. There's no way they can say no to this. This is such a heavy expectation to place upon a child. Emotional parentification. This is a difficult one because unlike instrumental parentification, which is task-based and others can see, emotional parentification is based on the relationship. I like to think of it as it being a mental framework and perspective which you're inculcating in your child without you realizing. And it will color how they see the world, how they move in the world, and how they relate with other people. This is where a parent begins to confide in their child adult problems. Now, the unfortunate thing is that it is often celebrated to mark closeness in the relationship or how much of friends they are. But the truth is, children do not have the capacity to handle adult problems. And what ends up happening is that you cripple your child emotionally and affect their adult emotional lives and the perspectives that they operate with. Especially if you're dealing with difficult things that cause you to be depressed or heartbroken, for example, like sickness or a marriage falling apart or your relationship with their parents, crying a lot in front of them or threatening to hurt yourself or more are not situations your child needs to be exposed to. These are conversations to have with your friends, your adult friends, peers, a therapist or a counselor, or even the person who is causing the issues to you. It doesn't matter how mature you feel your child is. They aren't in a place to process some of these things. As they get older, you may have the leeway to share some things. As they get to maybe late teens and early 20s and older, but even then, there are things that your children should not know. Emotional parentification occurs when a parent has their own attachment difficulties and in situations where there is generational trauma or trauma going on and when a parent is emotionally immature. An extreme facet of this is what is called emotional incest. This is where a parent puts the emotional responsibilities that belong to a spouse or an adult partner on their child of the opposite sex, confiding in them and expecting them to have decision-making capabilities and responsibilities in the family. You find this, especially with sons who are made the man of the house at a young age, thus robbing them the opportunity to be a child and exerting a huge demand on them to do what a grown man may even need time, wisdom, advice, and experience to do. Examples of this are venting about your spouse or their parent to them, getting reassurance from your child, making your child responsible for settling disagreements, between you and your partner, or making your child the messenger between you and your spouse or other adults, or making them deal with a sibling who is struggling. Even for girls, there's a dynamic of understanding the marital struggles of your mother, which I think should not happen. I feel like it really colors how young girls grow up to view relationships and what they understand relationships to be. And it antagonizes their relationship with their father. And this makes things very difficult because children are born loving their parents. And this is a dynamic of which they should not be privy to because they are not the partner, they are the child. They should not be included in some of these things. Learning to listen and emotionally validate is a skill that is important in life. But children do not have the emotional understanding or developmental capacity to deal with problems like a cheating spouse or a divorce. These are not things that children should have to be aware of. And it is also likely that if you're doing this, then you are also not present for your child and their problems, because you would minimize their problems because in the scale of things, they'd seem like nothing, even though children's problems are super important to them and they're huge to them. So it means that your child does not get the emotional support that they need. And this can result in your child developing internalizing behaviors, such as ignoring their own emotions, not advocating for their own needs, and an inability to set healthy boundaries with others. And this also occurs in situations of domestic abuse as well, because your child then feels that they have to protect you, when it should be the other way around, that you are protecting your child. Again, there's sympathy because this is a difficult situation, but I would encourage you to get the help that you need, not just for yourself and for your children. Some of the consequences and common things that you will see in a parentified child is depression, because the child is carrying bigger burdens than they need or that they can navigate. Anxiety, especially if the child believes or if the child's actions are responsible for the emotional equilibrium of the home. They may blame themselves and develop cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are irrational and negative thought patterns that could lead to severe depression and self-harm and other things. Guilt, because inherently kids understand that when they're not able to fulfill adult roles, and even if they're able to do them at a great capacity, there will be guilt at failures, perceived or the ones that they have been told that they failed, and it can create a culture of guilt and self-blame and low self-worth. Another is physical symptoms, stomach aches and headaches. As a child, I definitely used to get a lot of stomach aches when I was in situations where I felt out of my depth. And it got to the point where I even preferred being in boarding school as compared to being at home. Another thing, poor academic performance. Studies take a backseat when a child is doing more than they are supposed to do. And then there is a chance or likelihood of substance abuse, because this quote unquote soothes them because this is unavailable at home. A parentified child's life is punctuated with horrific duties like stopping one parent from harming another or harming a sibling, dealing with a parent under the influence, or preventing a parent from overdosing. It completely erases the joy of being a child, and it puts such heavy responsibilities on their child, with them feeling that their family and siblings cannot survive without them. There are many secrets a parentified child has to keep because there's a deep sense of how their home is not a normal home. And it takes away their ability to relax, to play, or just be a child. Play is how children are able to deal with things that bother them and get out anxious energy and just reset their worlds. Parentification takes this away from them. In all of this, there are long-term effects of parentification that show up as a child becomes older and eventually as they become adults. Number one, and they are in no particular order, just all of these things could show up. Fear of abandonment. They will do things and tasks to avoid being abandoned because this is essentially what happens with parentification. The parent abandons their duties in certain ways and then the child has to step up. So, in as much as they may not have the knowledge to articulate this, it does create a deep fear of abandonment. It does create relationship difficulties because your parent is the first template of what a relationship should be. And a parentified child often has a one-sided relationship with huge demands placed on them. It is likely that they will end up in relationships where the same is required of them. They will likely be prone to people please and not advocate for themselves or put in healthy boundaries. Their attachment styles will need healing to get them from being anxious, disorganized, or avoidant to secure. Another thing is disordered eating, because food is soothing and a soothing mechanism. I realized, like, with myself, when I did struggle with emotional struggles, I would definitely eat chocolate and things like that. But again, as I was healing, the need for that soothing definitely left. And I would encourage people, sometimes when there's binge eating that you don't understand, it might need for you to explore this with a therapist and work out the things that you've been avoiding. Emotional regulation issues, because a child is unable to rely on their parent to be present for them emotionally, and because of the weight of their responsibilities and the inability to say no, the child may have explosive incidences. Another thing is lacking a sense of self, because they do not know who they are beyond the tasks they are used to completing. And in relationships, they struggle to just be without caretaking and performing tasks in order to be liked. Being a child and playing is how you discover what you like, what you don't like, aspects of your personality, what you're meant to do, and things like that. But if you're a child in an adult's role, this is completely taken away from you. And so at some point in your life, you will need to work through and figure out who you truly are outside of the roles and the things that you used to do. Another thing is tying self-worth to your accomplishments. So you think that you're only as important as what you do, which then sets you up for being taken advantage of, especially in the workplace and even by virtue of the career that you do choose. Another thing is seeing your needs as a burden and an inability to ask for help when you need it. This is one I have definitely struggled with, but I'm thankful to be working through it. Compulsory working and caregiving, no matter the cost to you, and often your nuclear family will suffer and not understand why you're prioritizing others over them, and even prioritizing others over your own health and well-being. This is something that we see a lot, where people are unable to say no because this is how they were cultured, this is how they were brought up, that everything relied on them. And so you don't understand that there is a point where it doesn't need to be based on you, and there are other solutions. But because of that, you keep sacrificing and giving and giving and giving until it costs you your health or it costs you something much more important to you. The inability to let go of controlling things, which can lead to self-blame, guilt, and shame. It can also lead to meddling and manipulation of others to bring the outcome you want, because there was such a heavy responsibility placed on you so that everything would go a certain way. And life isn't like that. Especially once you become adults, you can't control your siblings, you can't control other human beings, but because this was an expectation created in childhood, it's very difficult for people to move out of this and to let people make their own choices and go on their own paths. So, as a parent, how do you deal with parentification? Recognizing it is the first step, then learning the developmentally appropriate tasks that your child should do is important. Having conversations with your child where you hear them out and, if necessary, apologize to them for what has happened in the past while reiterating what is your responsibility as a parent and what is theirs. Removing all the parental responsibilities from the table and taking charge of them, and not putting your child on the hook for this. Setting and maintaining boundaries, which is hard. It's okay for your child to see you upset. It's not their job to soothe you or comfort you or for them to be your confidant. You can check in with your child often to see how they're doing emotionally and mentally and how they're handling their responsibilities, and then adjust things if they're overwhelmed. Out of all of this, the last one is the most important one. Do your own work. See a therapist who is equipped to deal with this. I will prefer one who is trauma-informed and can deal with developmental or childhood trauma. And because you went through parentification, understanding that you need the help to rewire and to unlearn and relearn certain things is important. So this is part 1 of parentification. I've focused more on children because as adults, our responsibility to them is to care for them and to ensure that we do right by them. If as an adult, you see yourself in this, part 2 is for you, and no worries, you're not alone. We do this together and we heal and we work through these things together. I will also talk about how parentification plays out culturally for many of us. So as we close, let us pray. Heavenly Father, I know that this is a difficult topic. Many of us are not ready to confront the things that we have done or that were done to us by our caregivers. We often feel like we're sinning or in the wrong, yet your word even speaks of mothers abandoning children. You knew our pain even before we were here. Your word tells us to obey our parents in the Lord, and we forget the in the Lord part. Your word also still tells us and them not to provoke children to anger, but we often forget that. I want to pray and ask for your forgiveness for where we have harmed the little children, and ask you to guide us in your paths so that we may break the cycles and bring them up how you would require us to do. These are your precious ones. Teach us to walk in the right paths for your name's sake, that we may help them be everything that you put them here to be. As we untangle our hearts from the pains that we have faced, I pray that you lead us to the right spaces where the balm of Gilead soothes our pain and heals us so that we shall be able to be healed and be better for ourselves and for our children. Help us break the bonds that have held us and move into spaces of willing love, willing help, willing care, and willing choices rather than manipulation and oppression. Give us the courage to confront the pain and the lies and to walk in your righteousness. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. You can find us on Instagram as healing.growth and on Facebook as Trauma Healing and Growth. Thank you for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. My name is Saiton Riga from Healing Growth. Bye-bye.